All right, we will call Committee of the Whole to order. I know some members will probably be coming in. It's a little tricky when we start at 5:45, but I wanted to add on a little time so we could welcome our incoming Director of Finance and also make plenty of time for our important charter review discussion. So thank you all for being here tonight. First, I will move to approve the minutes of the July 15th Committee of the Whole without the necessity of a reading.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor? Aye. And that motion passes. Okay, so next we will take up Resolution 2024-50 regarding the appointment of Renee Mahoney to the Director of Finance. And I want to, first of all, welcome Ms. Mahoney officially. And you know, we'll kind of keep this just pretty casual, and if you would be so kind to just tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience, and how you chose to be with Lakewood. Oh, no. I mean, unless you're more comfortable standing, feel free to, yep, just turn on your mic so that everyone can hear you.
Hi, Council. So I went to the University of Toledo and graduated. First job was with the City of Shaker Heights. I worked there 20 years on and off, and eventually finished there as assistant director. Left a little bit in there. I was the founding business manager for Lakewood Catholic Academy here in Lakewood. And then Shaker called me back, said, "Don't you want to come back?" I said, "Okay." And the big project that I was good to be an extra person in the finance department because I was able to implement a new finance software system there. And then worked there until the offer came in Bay for a finance director position. And so I've been there the last almost 12 years, 11 and a half years. Yeah, and we've lived here in Lakewood since 2000, have 4 kids. They went to LCA for grade school, but then Lakewood Public for public school, or for high school. Very great experience there. We have our last son is about to graduate in December, and we will be tuition free. So I was counting 25 years straight of paying some kind of tuition. So looking forward to that.
I know that just gave you a positive vote for Councilman Baker if you have 4 Lakewood High School grads, probably. So. All right, so council members, any questions for Ms. Mahoney? No? Councilman Baker.
Thank you, Chair Keppel, and thank you, Director Mahoney. Look forward to working with you and getting to know more about you. You touched on a little bit talking about software. I know that anytime you change a kind of a finance management software system, it's a lot of work. You're not only retraining your staff, you're training yourself, and then everyone else, and then the government. And I'm curious of your time thus far in Lakewood. If you can comment on I don't know the answer to this question, I'm just curious. Comment on our current kind of finance management system. I'm familiar in my day job, we went from an older system to Munis. It took some time, but staff has seemed to get the hold of it, and it's a pretty good reporting system. Can you comment on what the city uses and if you see it as adequate?
Yeah, so and that's actually I transitioned to Munis in Shaker. And then when I started in Bay, I said, "Oh my goodness, what's these pin-fed printers and things like that?" And so we transitioned to, it used to be called, it's a Tyler product, Encode. They changed the name, but it's just for smaller municipalities, although I think it had just as much firepower as the Munis system. So yes, I'm all about being paperless, and I've seen too much paper already in our finance department, so that's one of my goals, is to start looking at a different finance system. From what I understand, the current system is 20 at least years old. It looks like it's 20 years old, the reports and things that come out. I'd like the directors to be able to, feel more comfortable about the system. And yes, that's definitely a goal, something I'm going to look into. Once I feel like the next few months figure out how the processes are now. I'm a big process improvement person. I don't like people to have to waste their time doing things. So if we can do it better and faster, I'm all about that.
Thank you. And in line with that, the city, we're both kind of the representative of the people who try to be as efficient as possible. We're also, there's a kind of a customer service aspect to it, when it relates to our utilities or, so water bills or income tax payments. We don't use Rita, so we do it all in-house. Some of the things just as a consumer I've noticed and curious if you've had any input on would be like how to pay those things, whether it be ACH or credit card, the city kind of eating the credit card fees, and within that some of the information security, like I think you can send in your income tax bill and just like write your credit card number down. That's probably not the best information security practice. So are there ways in which you've thought about that in which we may kind of make ourselves a little bit more customer oriented?
I have not had a chance to look at the income tax system. I know as a resident, I think it's clunky. I don't know how many different systems there are out there, so that I have not, looked into yet. But yes, I agree. Writing your credit card number probably isn't the safest. So, and in Bay, when I started there were no automatic payments, and we set up where people could have their payments ACH'd directly, and in Bay, they did share the credit card fees with the residents. So might, could look at different things, not necessarily, passing on that expense to the residents, but definitely looking at the costs of that and going forward.
Absolutely, yeah. We've had some, just to fill you in, we've had some discussions about it as the budget comes through each year, and there's two sides to it. One side is you want to be as convenient as possible to the residents, and some folks like to utilize their credit cards, or they need to for financial reasons. I do think that there's a substantial amount of residents that just use it because they get points, and if the city's paying 1.5%, 2%, then that's money we could be putting forth to projects.
Something else, right? I agree.
But I look forward to working with you. Your resume is great. As far as the COG goes, can you explain? I know that isn't there like a common payment? Will you continue in that role as the finance person for the COG? And could you explain how that relates to your role in City Hall?
So it's a bit of a separate role. They are a different financial entity. They have their own tax ID, and it's the 6 West Side cities. I calculate the cost based on population for each of the cities. And we have an administrative person that works in the office. She does most of the day-to-day. I'm more an advisory role. Right now, we're just starting the audit for them, so, a little bit of helping in that, gathering, stuff like that. And I usually do that after hours, or like I stay on Mondays and kind of work on that. So I just keep going, Marathon Monday.
So from a compatibilities of office and like public official standpoint, you're separate with them and then you're with us.
That's correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Look forward to working with you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks. You as well.
Other council members? Ewan? No? Councilman Bullock?
Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair. Director nominee Mahoney, nice to talk to you. What's going on with, is that me? Good to see you. Thanks for your service. Good to see your experience in other local governments and also your longtime residency in Lakewood. First, I hope to have the chance to sit down and get to know you over coffee at some point in the next week and a half, 2 weeks. So maybe on the back end of this meeting, we can pull out our calendars. Sure. Secondly, I guess I'd love to invite your comments about Lakewood's position, your first impressions on our financial position, which is something we've worked hard to improve over the years. Are we good, bad, ugly in terms of our balance sheet? Good, bad, ugly in terms of our current financial procedures? I mean, these are topics that we should be talking about on an ongoing basis. but compared to other communities that you've been to, and you know, maybe give us some thoughts about your recommendations on financial reserves, improvements to capital budgeting, and our ability to make strategic decisions as part of our budgeting process. I think my own impression is that we do some of those things well and other things we could improve upon. And as an advertisement in particular, there's a new opportunity under federal energy law called the Inflation Reduction Act, where for the first time 2 years ago, local governments were allowed the ability to get tax credits directly paid to us, even though we don't pay federal taxes. It's called direct pay. Nonprofits and local government entities can take advantage of that. If we were to pursue this, we'd have to get registered. We'd have to understand the process. There's some tax law capacity we need to develop. But without having to apply for grants, without having to wait around for finding out whether this is a yes or a no, we could get very significant amounts of capital matched, up to 30% of some projects, differing amounts for energy efficiency, clean energy. Some of these things are directly in our focus in the Cove Community Intergenerational Center, energy infrastructure that, you know, we're trying to get storage for storm outages there or backup, and then also make it a more efficient building. So can you give a 60-second response to all of that? Thanks.
Well, first, Councilman Bullock, I'm supposed to tell you I'm a big Irish fan, so my daughter actually went to St. Mary's and was in the marching band at Notre Dame, so big Irish fans. At a quick glance the last couple weeks, I've noticed the one thing that gives me a little bit of angst is the amount of debt that the city has taken in the last few years, or multiple years. I definitely would like to look and see how we can maybe change some policies or something like that to try and lower that debt balance, or fund things differently, like as you said, through different programs or things like that. I believe the finance staff is a great staff. They've had clean audits and the State Auditor's Award for many years, so I have a great staff to work with. And you know, every city, I feel, has been pretty fortunate in these last few years to receive, you know, federal funding. Some people might say it's a little too much federal funding, but the cities have definitely benefited from receiving ARPA funding and things like that. So, which is great to get some projects completed. So, I'm definitely interested in looking at more avenues that we can help to, especially fund the capital. I feel every city has the challenge of funding their capital infrastructure improvements. They do pretty well in the day-to-day operational funding, but it's when you have those big projects in capital that causes some problems. So.
And thank you, Director Designee Mahoney, and thanks, Madam Chair. Just a quick follow-up context. Some of the indicators for Lakewood's financials have been improving. Our income tax receipts have been increasing in recent years. Property values have been increasing. There's a lot of public opinion about that as well. I think on balance is a good thing, as long as we can help current and future residents find a place in Lakewood. That's also a good thing for all kinds of reasons on the property ownership. But what I'm hinting at is that the fundamentals of our balance sheet as a local budget may be shifting a bit in recent years. So compared to the 15, 20 years prior to that, our financial assumptions were certain things. Is it time to reevaluate? Maybe, maybe not. To significantly change our debt strategy would be a big one, given that nobody except Westlake has that much cash. Maybe there's a few people on the east side that have some.
Right.
But at any rate, I think those would be good and fruitful questions for us to explore, and so I'd look forward to working with you on those points.
Yeah, and through the last dozen years that I was in Bay, we improved our fund balance, cash balance threefold. That was a combination of, receiving more money in and being a little more fiscally responsible on the expenditure side too.
Any further questions from council members? Nope. All right. Then I will move to recommend Resolution 2024-50 to full council for adoption.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor? Aye. And that motion passes. All right. Thank you so much, and we'll officially welcome you aboard to the next full council member meeting, but still, we're glad you're here, so thank you. All right. All right, so next we will take up the report of the Charter Review Commission. And I'd like to invite, if Charter Review members, if you want to come up to the microphones and have a seat here, in case any of you want to chime in on this discussion. And I know Chair Dan, wherever you'd like to sit or stand, however you're most comfortable. I think we have the exact number of microphones, so it's almost as though we planned it. Wherever. You can sit or stand. You're welcome. Whatever's, I know you're used to addressing the court, so if you're more comfortable standing, that's, yeah, just push the button until it turns green.
There we go. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Great.
Yeah, it's just kind of reflex for me to stand up. Thank you, President Keppel and members of council and Mayor George for the opportunity to serve. I wanted to, we had a really terrific group of members of the Charter Review Commission. I don't think I knew many of you when we started, a little bit, but we all worked together, I think, extremely constructively and positively. Even when we disagreed, which is exceptional in these days. And so I feel like what the report that we've come out with is a good reflection on all of us. And there are several areas that we want to recommend to your consideration. So I think I'll just give a quick overview, and then I think as we'll let the members of the commission add their comments, or we can answer questions as we go. The report speaks to the process. I don't think we need to go over that now. There are 6 proposed amendments to the charter. I think they're ambitious yet conservative in scope. The first relates to the salaries of elected officials. There is a concern that was expressed by members of the commission and others who spoke with us that making the service on council accessible to even those people that don't have jobs that would lend itself to that role is important, an important value. And so creating a situation where the pay for council members reflects the current market values rather than reinvent the wheel, because the wheel really hasn't had much time to go around the block yet with the current system of the Civil Service Commission recommending changes that council can accept or reject. What we did is expanded the scope of that to allow the Civil Service Commission to make those recommendations, if warranted, more often, every 2 years. We also expanded the scope of, and then we took away what we thought might be a few impediments to actual increases going into effect for members of council, or decreases if that's what it comes to, because there haven't been changes in the very recent future, or I'm sorry, in the very recent past, or really in the long past. And we think that because of the politics of that and other reasons, the charter ought to lend itself to making that more possible to do. So we recommended changing removing certain provisions that were limiting in the charter, including interim raises. We're recommending a charter amendment that would prohibit or would remove that prohibition. And we also recommended that the city council president be paid 120% of their salary. We met both with all of you and with members of the Civil Service Commission, and I think we've gotten the best thinking of everybody in the community, and we've included it here. Second provision is really at the request of the law department, and that is to allow them to kill less trees and to present amendments to legislation more in the way that I was used to seeing it as a member of the legislature, with red line, with strikeouts and new language, as opposed to having to rewrite the ordinance and causing potentially confusion for the public and for members of council. So we think that's a simple fix that's easy to do. I don't know that it needs to be in the charter, but we don't know that it doesn't. So I think it makes it a little bit easier and gives some confidence for the members of the law department to make sure that that they'll be enforceable. We also recommended some language that clarifies the process of amending the charter. We also learned that Lakewood's charter unusually had no provision for reapportionment, and despite that, the wards have stayed remarkably equal in the distribution of population, except for one. But we thought it was important to have a safeguard, and after considering all kinds of potential expertise to make recommendations to council about reapportionment, we settled on the Planning Commission, whose job it is to make maps, to give consideration and propose redistricting plans if warranted, and we set some guardrails regarding the distribution and the fairness, and hopefully guardrails that will prevent the politicization or gerrymandering that we see in so many other contexts of redistricting, but makes it simple. Recommendation from the Planning Commission to council, and council then could enact, and will be required to enact unless for some reason one of those guardrails is violated. So kind of creating some again, more protections against a council not this council, but a council in the future that might want to use the redistricting process for its own political goals. We also similarly looked at the appointment of members to council. Councilman Bullock brought some of this to our attention. The process is not codified or in the charter, and what we found is that the process that council's been using by and large has been a pretty good process and pretty successful. So our thought was to lock that in, so that future councils will follow very public, very process-oriented efforts. I understand there's going to be a new council appointment coming up, so this charter amendment won't be in place by then, but I think we'll see again how that process works. There was some concern and consideration of whether executive sessions in the council appointment process should be prohibited, and we decided against recommending that to council. But there was some strong feelings among members of the commission that that's something to consider. Certainly, nobody requires council to go into executive session, and the law may or may not allow it in this context. But I wanted to make sure that we shared that concern, although we left that option in council's hands. And then finally, we in a almost unanimous vote, have recommended to council that it consider an amendment that would allow council to decide at some point in the future if the city of Lakewood wanted to move to ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting we've done a pretty good explanation, I think, of it in our report. It seems complicated at first, but the more you get comfortable with the math, it makes more sense. There are some advantages I think that we became aware of. One being that we could eliminate the need for a primary. So that's an election process and cost that would be that the city and the county would save in the event that the ranked choice voting. It's kind of an instant primary that goes on in these circumstances. We also think, and there was strong argument that ranked choice voting will lead to more civil discourse in light of the fact that if there are multiple candidates running in a race, that the risk of attacking one another could potentially diminish those second and third choice votes that might make it more likely that the candidate gets elected to office. Hopefully allowing the candidates to focus more on the issues and to improve civil discourse. And as I said in our meeting, if we can do anything, any day, at this point in American history, to improve the civility of government and politics, I think it would be to the benefit of the entire community that we do that. There was also some concerns that were raised about why we are trying to solve a problem that perhaps may not exist, and I'm sure some members of the commission may want to speak to that as well. However, I think that Lakewood, along with Cleveland Heights, which is also recommended, University Heights' Charter Commission also recommended ranked choice voting. But the communities like ours that are, we like to think, thought leaders in the state are the right place to allow this experiment in democracy to start to unfold here in Ohio. I believe there's a constitutional amendment on the ballot in Idaho this year to enact ranked choice voting. There's ranked choice voting in Maine and in parts of California. So this is not a concept that is not tested. We did also hear from the Board of Elections concerns about having to do work to make this work for them, and I think those are things that are surmountable. It really comes down to a programming issue on their software that and hardware that they've already acquired for voting. So ultimately, I think that's again a solvable problem in the future. But should any of those factors, and there's also been a movement in the state legislature where civil discourse is not valued at this time. Unfortunately, Councilman Rader, hopefully you'll make that better. But to prohibit this type of voting activity in Ohio, it hasn't gotten out of committee. I don't expect that it will, but by giving council the option of doing one or the other I think makes sense, because we have those safety, those outlets in place in case something like that were to happen. The other issue that we kind of considered at the same time was the timing of the municipal primary, and it's historically been held in September, and we have recommended the council include in the amendment a change to have that primary held in May. With that, I'm going to invite my other members of the commission to share their thoughts.
We can also wait when we do it subject by subject, and I know some of you have contributed particular expertise and particular research in certain areas, so we can chime in. Thank you, Chair Dan, for that overview. So let's kind of, I think, maybe eat this elephant one bite at a time. And first, I just want to thank the members of Charter Review Commission as well as our law department. And I know Director Vargo and Assistant Director Swallow have been working hard to facilitate these meetings and done a great job with that. Okay, so let's start. I know Councilman Rader, you had a question. Let's start with that area, and as good a place to start as any.
Thank you. Next year I had, and thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Commission for dedicating your time to this. I think we've shared some of our thanks last time we met, but really do appreciate all the energy and time you put into this. It's been a fascinating process to watch to unfold, and it's really neat to kind of see our democracy being iterated upon in, I think, a very positive way here, and strengthened, I think, too, through your hard work. So thank you. One thing on process, this is the first time I've gone through this, it only happens every 10 years. Maybe some others that have been on council longer or the law department can fill us in on what happens at this point, what we're kind of doing here today in terms of what happens if we accept these recommendations. I'm sure there'll be some legislation that comes that we'll have to then vote on. How does that process look moving forward, Madam Chair?
So as I understand it, and I can let, I don't know if Director Varga, if you want to go through it, but the way the charter currently reads is that council may adopt any of these changes. So may gives us permission to adopt them, not adopt them, change them. And then any recommendations that we would make, and that language would then go to the voters and to then make those changes or not. So I believe we're looking at the deadline just in terms of time process. I think it would be almost impossible to get it on this next ballot, but so we have some time to be thinking about these essentially.
Very good. Thank you. I was wondering about that. So I did have one question as it pertains to redistricting for the commission through the chair. Is there any constitutional amendment that affects cities and how we do our process for redistricting, or any code or any administrative code? I just remember reading about Cleveland's going through the similar process and there being some requirement to report to the state what we do at a certain time in order to redistrict. Just wondered if that was taken into consideration, how it comports with Ohio Revised Codes, if there is a code that speaks to it specifically.
I don't know if that's on or not. I'm not aware of any. I think that this is, we strongly protect our independence and our home rule here. And so I don't think that that's really a function of the state to determine the apportionment.
I would agree. So this hasn't been something that the state has essentially screwed with, and we have complete sort of carte blanche when it comes to, and that's helpful to know as I think we move forward. So, and I agree with your recommendations. I think your guardrails set out here make a lot of sense. But that's all I have for right now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And it might be worth noting some of those guardrails that were put in place, and I know, Ms. Warner, I don't know, I want to call you out if you're not prepared, but I know you worked on this. So do you want to talk a little bit about what some of the what those guardrails are in that section?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So as part of our research, we looked at what other cities across the state of Ohio have put into place. I was surprised to learn that there are some cities that have no wards at all, and so all their council members are at large. And some have language about redistricting and some do not. Most of this language actually was lifted from or amended from other cities who have some sort of redistricting process codified, whether it's through ordinance or through their charter. And the requirements, when you sort of say them, they make a lot of sense. And I think when you think about a city like Lakewood that is mostly a rectangle, feels relatively straightforward, so that that our ward boundaries would be required to be contiguous, that they would be compact, that they would be, you would use either natural boundaries, not that we have rivers or things like that running through the middle of our city at this point, or streets. So you're not dividing up households, you're not dividing up blocks, you're not dividing up, you're not making some sort of S shape through the city of Cleveland, and so, or not through Cleveland, through Lakewood. So those were the initial sort of guardrails that we thought about, and sort of did some testing of well, if you wanted to try to do this configuration, would these guardrails really prevent kind of a funky, snake along the lake type situation? And we felt like they did.
Councilman members, any further questions on the redistricting section? Yes, Councilman Baker.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And my question isn't necessarily on redistricting, it's on the process, and I think it was touched on, but I'd just like a little more clarification on it. And first, thank you to all the Charter Review members. Sometimes we double booked, so we were unable to watch your process and hear it, but we got reports from council, and very thankful for all of your efforts. And you guys had a group, a lot of different perspectives, and I think you brought forth something that's really good, and we need to chew on it. And that's the question that I have for the law department is, do we see these coming as like separate ordinances if council, or is it just we indicate in the resolution that we would like A, B, C, D changed, and we enact it, and then it goes. So I'm wondering about the process. Are there separate resolutions for each one we actually want to put forth to the Board of Elections? How do we see this going?
Thank you, Councilman. Two things. Number one, we'll thoroughly study the process, and I'll consult with Ms. Swallow, who was there every step of the way. But as I read the relevant provision, given the expense of putting it on the elections, we will want whatever recommendations that council feels it wants to recommend to the voting public. Pretty certain we should do that all together for the sake of efficiency of costs. So what happens is you'll take the recommendation from the commission, and if council by a 2/3 vote agrees with the recommendation, approves the recommendation, wants to put it on the ballot, it has to go on the ballot. So if there's 3 of them or 4 of them, we'll put them together and we'll put it on the ballot. But there's expense to that, obviously.
And so I think this is important, particularly as thinking as a voter, right? Are you suggesting that it would go up as kind of like a slate, or it would be I'd be able to vote on council salaries up, down, and then I'd be able to vote on enactment of ordinances, kind of the more process-oriented one separately, or are you envisioning their one slate of issues?
Well, again, Councilman, we will study that. I mean, my presumption is that the voters can pick and choose. I think that
I
makes
prefer that, but
yeah, I think that makes logical sense. I don't think there's a requirement for a slate, but all of them would be on the same. I guess I misunderstood your question. They would all be on the same ballot, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the voter would have to vote up or down on all of them as a slate. But we'll continue to look at that. We have time for the process.
Thank you, and that's very helpful. I just was curious. I know last time we did it, it was like we literally had an amended charter, so that was a whole different process than amending sections of the charter. Okay. And then on the redistricting piece, and this is what I'm curious about, and if there was any discussion within the commission, you know, and certainly the way we've done things isn't the way we should continue to do things, and that's not a good reason to continue to do things a certain way. I have thought that there's a certain benefit, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just momentum, or we've always done it that way, of like having both the north end of town and the south end of town in a ward. But I could see maybe some downsides to that as well. So I'm wondering if the commission kind of thought about that and it came up in the discussions, because that's traditionally what we've had. And our ward boundaries are really just in code, so council could enact an ordinance anyways to change them. But I'm curious if that issue came up.
I think we talked less about specifically what they should be. I think I agree with you that it does feel like there's some benefit to having sort of the north-south lines. But we did not, I think, articulate a point of view about what they should be or should look like.
Great, thank you. And I think that, you know, the compactness, kind of the qualifiers that you put in there would inherently make it either go north-south or east-west, right? There's really no other way to do it. So I think it's a thoughtful approach, and I, you know, looking at it, I think former Council President O'Malley's the one who kind of had the study done at first that showed that Ward 4 just has more residents, right? And Ward 1 actually has the least, I think. So land doesn't vote, people do, and so we should think about that. So I think it's a thoughtful approach.
Councilwoman Marks?
Being the council person for Ward 4, One of the benefits, I think, going from north to south is that our community is pretty much kind of segregated, wealthy on the north and people that are less fortunate on the south. Personally, as a Ward 4 council person, having the largest population and the greatest diversity, I think it works very well because I get to represent both sides of that and try to be equitable with regardless of whatever decisions are made. I would hate to see it go east-west where people are then segregated by income rather than locality. And also as a Ward 4 representative, even though I have more people in my ward, I don't believe that I am busier than other people. And I have fewer calls from the Gold Coast than I do south of Detroit. So I don't feel overworked or overtaxed. So I think the Gold Coast, they all are private properties also. So you occasionally will get contacted by a resident if their property manager isn't resolving some issues. But, I would have to say that I'm serving private residences more completely. So I don't have a problem with the districting in Ward 4 currently as it exists. But I think it's an important thing to look at in the future because our city is dynamically changing with lots of new construction going on. So I think we need to build something over in Ward 1. Let's build a major complex over there for Councilman Baker. But I appreciate your thoughtfulness in looking at redistricting and all of your hard work in really evaluating what's going to work best for our city. So I appreciate all of your time and energy. Thank you.
Right.
Do you want?
Oh.
I think Judy has.
I did have a question for you. Do you know the percentage of voters in each of your districts? Because you might have a large number of people in the district, but you may have the same number of voters.
I can tell you that there are fewer
subject
voters.
that came up.
Fewer voters south of Detroit. I would say the majority of voters live on the Gold Coast.
Correct, but comparing the two districts, the two wards.
Yeah, and I don't.
Do you know the difference in
I
the
do know.
voting number of voters?
I do believe in this. 2021 was a year which I try to erase from my memory, but in looking at every precinct and good year for the president. And Ward 1, I do think, has the highest voter turnout, generally speaking, which, lots of factors, right? Probably more single-family homes, probably more owner-occupied, so the folks vote. It's easier to vote. You're not updating your, registration every time you're moving. So I do think that probably is true, although I don't want to say it for certain because it changes every year.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
So we talked about those kind of things, and we were very curious about those, but we were always very mindful and very well advised and reminded that this is basically a constitution. So we can talk about immediate things, but we're talking about suggesting durable type changes that would be effective and make if things changed. So there may, there could be economic redevelopment in some part of the city that that we're not foreseeing now. So there was this constant sort of, let's learn about the immediate issues, but let's remember that we're recommending things to be basically our Constitution, something that has to be a document that lasts. So to your point about how many people are in each ward and whether north, south, right or wrong, we decided, I think correctly, to sort of avoid that level of specificity in a charter.
And just to reiterate Jim's point about it being in the Constitution, that's why we felt that it was important to put the word redistricting in the Constitution, well, in the charter, because it hasn't been done in so long. And so at least the charter would trigger that every 10 years this has to be done, and we don't have to wait on, a council to take that initiative. It's already there. It's that the mechanism is there, and it will stay there until somebody else comes along and decides it's no longer needed.
And thank you. And with regard to that, I'm curious, if you thought about this, and maybe the law department, Director Vargo can give some insight. It says that the, Planning Commission, which I assume will be aided by planning staff, they'll kind of come up with some sort of recommendation, data, kind of feed the commission that information to then make a educated recommendation based upon the categories that you've outlined in the charter or in the proposed amendment. What's interesting is you say, or what's proposed as City Council shall adopt and enact them proposed by the Planning Commission unless they find, not contiguous, not compact, not bounded by natural boundaries or streets. So I guess what does a conflict between Planning Commission and Council mean then, right? So if Planning Commission recommends something, and it's just an interesting thought exercise, and Council says, no, we think that, it's not contiguous and compact.
So I want to, that was quite intentional in the way, I don't know if my microphone's working or not, but it's quite intentional in how we drafted that. We thought, again, with one of the goals being to keep politics and the potential for gerrymandering at a minimum, that the Planning Commission is composed of members appointed by both the mayor and council. So there's some diversity there, but there's also a separate entity whose terms in life may go beyond certain members of council, and that looking to I think we had a couple of lawyers on the commission, and looking to future potential litigation, setting those guardrails very specifically for council, almost like the way we looked at the salary amendment. This is something that we want to try to keep politics out of, and the way to do that is to set those objective criteria. By the way, to Councilman Mark's concerns, physics tells us that there aren't very many ways to do this that aren't north-south, at least in the way I think we were looking at it. So that did come up in our conversations, but it'd be hard to do that. The easiest way to do this, the way that we've suggested, would be with those districts as things stand now and as our population is set. But I do think it's important that we not that there's any reflection on members of this council, but that a future council could use that process for political purposes to exclude a member or to punish somebody, or to, this whole idea. And I think we'll hear a lot about it in the next 107 days about politicians choosing their own districts as opposed to the districts, people in the districts choosing the politicians. And so I think, again, this will put us in the forefront of thinking about these kinds of things, and hopefully the state will join us shortly.
I just want to add to what Mark has said, is that I think in the process, we were very forward-thinking and very visionary, and thinking past the existing council, and in even looking back at past councils. Jim would always remind us, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And it's like, well, it's not a problem today, but we need to think about the future. Sorry to put you on the spot. So, so that's sort of how our frame of thinking has been in what we were proposing in our discussions as well.
I will say, Councilman Baker, to your original question about what happens if the Planning Commission makes a set of recommendations and City Council says, we don't think it's these things and we're not going to pass it, then what? And the Planning Commission says, oh no, we think we've done it. I think you're right that the language that we have drafted here so far actually leaves that pretty unresolved. And so maybe would be something that you all would want to find a way to add another sentence about making sort of the resolution really clear. Other city charters sort of say the City Council gets to do it, and if they don't do it in 120 days, the mayor or the law director or somebody just sort of decides. And so I think there is potentially a sentence needed here in case of that type of conflict.
Yeah, and I, taking that thought exercise to its logical conclusion, I actually think that it, right now, City Council one of us could draft an ordinance changing the district boundaries, right, or the ward boundaries, because it's outlined in code, and we can just amend the code. So I do think this at least creates, to the point, I think it was Commissioner Dan said, that it provides a 10-year process to kind of re-review it. And ultimately, if a future council was like, no, this non-political body that really studied it, we don't accept their recommendation, I think that technically, it's like, a legislation is emergency because we say it's emergency and we pass it on first reading, right? There's really no emergency, but it's emergency because we deem it an emergency. I think that a theoretical council could do that, and then it would just be a political issue, right? Which actually I think is not like a bad political issue, but it would be like the public would say, this impartial body taking in the evidence suggested this, and you said no. So explain yourself, right? So I actually think it creates an accountability structure, to allow that. So I actually don't know if we need another, but I'm interested in the law department's take on it, because I think it does create at least a process interrupter that requires us to think hard about it and take a hard vote about it, right, in the future.
Yeah, I think that was part of the discussion, because part of my original this was all brought up because we knew the wards were out of sync, at least with Ward 1 and being, I think, 10% smaller than Ward 4, yes. And we'd read some info from good government groups that has suggested that when they're looking at ward distribution or district distribution, you want to keep it within a 10% bound. So there was talk about, should we have an automatic trigger that when the census comes out, if any of the wards are greater than 10% out of balance, that automatically requires a redrawing of the wards. That was rejected in favor of just having the Planning Commission have the duty to, whenever the census comes out, no matter what the balance of the districts is, that they're going to take a look at it, whether it's 2% out of whack or whether it's 30, and that we trust that they'll go through whatever process they want to go through, but they're not required to do anything. They're just required to review it and then make whatever recommendations. So since there's no requirement that they act, so I don't think we wanted to have the further drawn out process, because it's possible they won't do anything. And the way it is, if they decide something has to be done and council says no, then it's either up to the Planning Commission, I guess, could probably institute some sort of litigation on its own, or a citizens group could do that, and if they felt strongly enough about the issue to say, we really think these need to happen, or obviously there's political consequences that we just talked about if people think that council was trying to, for their own self-interest, keep the districts as they were, as opposed to what was recommended by the Planning Commission.
Thank you. Yeah, and I recall that there was discussion too about, okay, so maybe it's, in an ideal world, you'd want to shift it, but you don't want to have part of this street and part of that street, and it then becomes cumbersome. So that's why we wanted to have just encourage that dialogue. And also on the time issue of, because charters to the point we were making before about the charter essentially being our constitution and wanting to stand, the test of time, because anything that we may put in front of voters, they may or may not choose to adopt, right? So we put this in front of voters, let's say they adopt it, and then the next census, then they review it, and, it could be 20 years before a district is redrawn. However, the language is in place to begin that process, and each of these things is charter reviews every 10 years, and the census every 10 years, so it could take a very long time, kind of the same issue with the salaries. But anyway, I digress. I know Councilman Bullock, you had a question on this topic.
Sure. Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, commissioners from the Charter Review Commission. And I see a number of members of the League of Women Voters whom I deeply respect out here in the audience as well. My question on this one is specific to whether the Planning Commission is the right choice for this. It probably is, but I would welcome thoughts. But maybe as a preliminary kind of comment, I want to just, as an overview, say thanks for the thorough review of city procedures and laws and processes that don't frequently get a look. So I think the Charter Review Commission has done a good job of that, because there are some things that you've taken up as fresh, fresh angles of attack or fresh insights with the benefit of experience, or just your own insights. And then other things are matters we use all the time, but we're busy with work a day, work a year, business of government. So it's a healthy process. What strikes me is that some of these thoughtful recommendations, I probably prefer to use ordinances rather than the charter to accomplish. I recognize, though, that your scope of work is to propose charter amendments, so that's what you're doing here. But that said, I think maybe right tool, right job. Some of these would live more appropriately, I think, in the ordinances. This one, I'm happy to support as a proposed charter amendment. Yeah, so I guess if we're going to take up the other topics, I know we're running short on time. For this one particular one, my question is just, planning commissioners, are they the right folks to do it? I suppose what they would do is planning commissioners tend to think in small changes and enduring. They want consistency with what's come before. That probably is a sober-minded place to put it, but you could propose something different, such as a new commission of citizens to do reapportionment. So I'd love your thoughts.
We looked at all those options. We looked at a separate commission. We thought that perhaps there are a lot of commissions in Lakewood, and there was one that already existed. The second thing, I think that the folks on the staff of the Planning Commission can do math, and that's what they do. I mean, they do maps and math, and so that seems to me to be 100% of what you need to look at here. And I do think that an entity that's less political than council, and I think that's part of what went into the recommendation as well, to put council on that spot that Councilman Baker identified, to consider doing this only within the guardrails of voters choosing their elected officials as opposed to the other way.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good precedent to set. You'd accomplish removing it from the political process in a direct sense. I think a number of us would request that the ward boundaries go from the center line down the middle of the street to in between the streets, so residents on Woodward Avenue, for example, would know which ward they are in and not always be scratching their heads about which side of the street. That sort of thing would be a welcome change. And it sounds as if there may be a shift of more streets than that, given population. But anyway, I think it's a thoughtful suggestion.
Councilman Rader?
Thank you. One more quick question on this. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but would love to know how the Charter Commission thinks about this. But I don't see anything in here prohibiting us from using another process. This process it lays out what we need to do every 10 years. But council could then easily go and change it back if we were to go edit the ordinance, correct? So is there any thought given, or do you think this is the opinion of the commission, or any thoughts on prohibiting council from sort of acting on their own and requiring that this process be the only place we can change districts? Is that discussed?
It wasn't, in light of the fact that it hasn't been done in 40 years.
Okay.
We assumed,
Pretty safe.
we thought it was a pretty safe to just poke everybody every 10 to take a look at it.
Okay, no, that's great. I mean, I was just trying to understand if, if there was any talk that council should be really bound to this process, or it was just really, like you said, to kick this process off, to make us think about it, make us do it every 10 years. So that clears that up. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any further questions, discussion on the topic of redistricting? All right, we've got 13 minutes. So I don't think we're going to get through ranked choice voting in 13 minutes, so I'm sorry. But let's maybe talk, can we talk about amending legislation maybe? That might be less fraught. And then I do want to also respect all of your time, and we've committed a lot of time already. My thought process, because you've put a lot of thought into this, this is a very important document for our city. I want to be thoughtful about this and intentional and really take time and digest it and discuss it. So my intention would be that we would invite you back to continue and these sort of chunks section by section. So so apologies, we're not getting through all tonight. I didn't really think that we would, but I hope you're amenable to that. I'm also respectful of that you have lives and jobs and things too. So if you can't all make it all the time, that is okay. We can try to maybe get a schedule together of certain ones if you want to make sure you're here for certain topics. Okay, so Director Vargu, I'm assuming you would like to talk to us about amending legislation.
Thank you, Madam President, and I'll say that the primary drafter of our legislation, of course, is Ms. Swallow. And this was an issue that she raised, and it just would make her job more efficient. The charter now requires, as you see in the ordinances and resolutions brought before you, that if we are deleting a single sentence out of an extended section, then the entire section has to be presented and repealed, and then a new section put in with the added change. This will just make things more efficient. However, obviously, Ms. Swallow's been doing this. She's very comfortable with it, and any lawyer would be. So this is something that could be joined with other recommendations to the voters. In no way would we ever recommend this to be the sole item on the ballot, given the expense of it. So thank you for your consideration.
All right, council members, questions on this topic? Councilman Bullock?
Thanks. So clarification, this requirement is currently in the charter or is in Lakewood codified ordinances? The current rules about how we make amendments?
Thank you, Councilman. It is in the charter.
Okay. To me, this should live in the ordinances rather than the charter. So what I would recommend is that I've had that thought myself, that it's just hard to parse the way, in fact, at 7 o'clock, we're going to have such a draft proposed ordinance in front of us where we have to do it all section by section. So I'm not recalling why it's in the charter. I think this is a good change, and I'd be happy to support it. What I'm driving at is perhaps all of it should be stricken and it should be replaced just with an ordinance, unless there's some big reason not to do that. But to me, there's the right tool, the right job. The most time-responsive types of policies and procedures you adopt administratively, or in the legislative body you have parliamentary rules. Something of enduring value you put in the ordinances. We don't really change our rules and procedures all that frequently in the ordinances. The things that you intentionally want to make difficult to change and expensive to change because you don't want them to change for decades, you put in the charter. I don't think drafting rules belong in the charter. Probably what does belong in the charter is voting thresholds, things like that, right? Core powers of the mayor, of council, of directors, et cetera. That makes sense. But anyway, I take the time to mention that because I think that framework I'm arguing from applies to a couple of other things on the list here as well.
If I could just comment, I agree entirely. Unfortunately, the language requiring the cumbersome process is in the charter. I think the intent behind it, and I'm just being very presumptuous here, the intent behind it was probably individuals on the commission saying we want the public to know what's being taken out, what's going in, and therefore let's give them the whole picture. But that is interpretation of drafting materials, and I agree entirely. It doesn't sound like that should be a constitutional charter type issue. Thank you.
Other council members on this topic? Nothing? Okay. All right, I have a question just the way I'm reading this to understand the language actually. So it says, no ordinance, resolution, or section of an ordinance or resolution shall be repealed, revised, or amended unless the new ordinance or resolution contains the entire ordinance or resolution or section to be repealed. So we would still have to quote the entire ordinance, right, if we're changing something that exists. And then revisions or amendments to an ordinance or resolution shall be clearly indicated by underlying. So it would still be listed, we just wouldn't be repealing it? Am I not reading that correctly? I'm confused.
My understanding of the current process is that you essentially have to say, we are repealing this, and you have the entirety of the prior thing that's being even not so much even repealed, but are amended or changed. So
Right.
you say, here's what's being changed, and
Right.
then you put the entirety of the new language below it. And so you have all this typing, and then it's unclear unless you are very carefully reading what the changes actually are. because you just have the new text below it and the old text above it. And this way, instead, it's going to be like anyone who does, document editing in there, it's going to be what is new is underlined and what is being removed is being struck. So you can see very clearly what is being added, what is being removed, and where that's happening, instead of trying to compare and contrast the two methods.
I see. I think where my confusion is because like up here, we typically request a redlined version, so we are seeing that. But so we're still, this would still be including the original language, and then be showing. So we're still including that, but then we're also putting in the redline version.
I think a good example is, let's say I bring forward a resolution to amend section whatever of the Lakewood codified ordinances. Instead of then having to put how it currently reads and say is repealed and then put is hereby amended to be, and then it's that repeated again with the red line.
Yeah.
You take out that whole first part and you say section blah, blah, blah of the Lakewood codified ordinances is hereby amended to be this. And as long as you can show the changes with red line and strike through, then that would be appropriate.
Yeah, so using this, charter amendment as an example, this would be the entirety of the ordinance. You wouldn't have the old ordinance and then the new ordinance below it. It would just be this with the changes underlined and struck through like it is on this document here, and then you'd vote yea or nay on it.
Got it. Okay.
And I think the
Which, Madam Chair, is more easy to understand.
Well, it is easy to understand, and I think also that it's the previous language may have come before a time when the technology existed to easily do this type of thing. Exactly. I'm sorry, you were saying, Ms. Warner.
Oh, I was just going to say that, you had brought up, it says the entire, and I think this is also meant to say you have to look at the whole thing, and you can't just take a sentence and say we're going to delete that, right? Because that would be very difficult for the public to follow. So that's probably why you're like, the entire thing, yes.
Madam Chair, I'd just like for 10 seconds to offer a contrary point of view to Councilman Bullock on this issue. One of the values that we
alternative, complementary point of view?
Yes, right. That we embraced through this process was creating a level of transparency in government, and this, we believe, is a step in that direction. And I do think that's a value that should be enshrined in a constitution-like document. And I do think that this is, now, the technology may change, and to Councilman Bullock's point, and so there may be some better way to do it at another time. But I think ensuring that that the legislation that's considered by council is easy to understand by members of the public is a value that is of a constitutional level, and I think that's why we chose to include it in this recommendation.
Again, visionary, future thinking, not the existing council, future councils, what can happen in 10 years and what is society going to look like. I think that was a lot of our conversations as well. A lot of these, and I think it can be easy to take certain things personal, like, they don't think we're doing things right. They think this is a problem, this is a problem. Well, no, that we're not saying that it's you. It's nothing against any individual person. It's just, again, like Mark, said, it's providing that level of transparency and accountability within the Constitution, which is important in this day and age.
I think that's well said, and I'll just speak for myself that I've enjoyed sitting in on many of your sessions and watching our, government how it's supposed to work with, which is refreshing change of citizens, discussing sometimes passionately but with respect and coming to these conversations. And always, as in the times that I've given feedback to, is it's not about any particular person currently or in the past or in the future being in this position, but building structures that can stand this test of time. And in our current age, we've seen that some things that were trusted to norms we see now that they really should be enshrined. So it's worth having these conversations even about things like redlining, I think, just to note that we're at least having the conversation. Councilman Bullock.
Yeah, just a quick response. I support the change. I appreciate the thoughtful discussion, but to stay with the commissioners, because this, I think, applies to other recommendations as well. So what I would recommend or invite, or maybe we could work together, the draft would be a charter amendment that establishes as a principle of Lakewood City government that we have transparency as a guiding requirement. What's here is that principle, but prescribed in very specific terms, which we're hearing from our law department has in practice become cumbersome, and then we don't have the ability to change it without going to the voters for a change. So, so in other words, the unintended consequence, admittedly something small, right? Let's stipulate what Law Director Vargo's, he's anticipating the original intent was enforce transparency, and that for sure is where because we all need more of that. But as it turns out, it's unsuccessful because, as your colleague just described, it turns out it sometimes is more difficult to parse what the new change does because I have to go back and read the whole paragraph in context, flip forward a page and a half, read the new paragraph in context, try to assemble it in my head, whereas if you just had this one snapshot view of the red lines, the strike, the edits, and the additions, that's actually more comprehensible by the members of the public, okay? So that's what I mean by right tool, right job. I would say the right tool for the charter would be to clarify in whatever way possible, and you can't do it in a detailed manner in every circumstance, but you could give it a shot at saying transparency shall be a guiding principle. It's going to be required in a variety of ways, but the detailed implementation comes in the ordinances in this case, and in other things it would have to be in the building, in administrative procedures. An example would be we don't try very frequently, if ever, to mandate the form of a building permit application. That's an administrative rule, and it needs to be flexible and adjustable, right? So I think there's a middle ground here where you guys are doing a fantastic job of challenging, inviting your neighbors and the whole community to take some growing steps towards better living up to the values that the whole community wants us to. That's superb. And then there's the details, like this is quite prescriptive, and to me, you'd want to have the ability to be flexible more than once every 10 years to make an administrative adjustment.
Okay, well, thank you. And we are 1 minute past time, so I'm gonna, without objection, we will adjourn committee of the whole, and housing planning development will start in the chair.
That's fine.
I know,
Yay. We get to see each other again. I know. It's awesome.
Next time we should go out for drinks afterwards.
You're damn right we should. Let's do that.
Not enough drinking
Next
on this commission.
time, let's go get a beer.
Yeah, there's not enough drinking on this commission.
Yeah,
That's what I think.
well, yeah. We're definitely doing that. Oh, yeah.
Great ideas for coming back. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Good shirt. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Judy. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. You're doing a great job. I don't shake your hand yet. All right. Thank you for coming in and
Of course.
all this work.
Pleasure, thank you.
Judy, thanks. All right, so we'll see you again soon, right? Yes. Cool. All right, thanks.
My buddy just read Flea's biography. It's really, really good.
Good evening, everybody. Why don't we start in 60 seconds for the Housing Planning and Development Committee? Okay, thanks, everyone. Let's call to order the meeting of the Housing Planning and Development Committee. We have a full quorum today, or all members are present. I'd like to first move that we approve the minutes of the July 15 meeting of the Housing Planning and Development Committee. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you. So let's proceed to propose ordinance 41-2023 as substituted in committee at our June 24 meeting. That is on the docket, and you'll see, if everyone can call that up in your Granicus, you'll see the most recent changes incorporated from an amendment by Councilman Baker and seconded by me and approved by the committee at the last hearing. And so we have that version in front of us on the docket. I think ideally we could finish our deliberation tonight. On the other hand, we don't have a council meeting until after Labor Day. Is that correct? I believe, Council President?
That is true. It is possible we may be having a special meeting, but currently as it stands, we don't intend to have a regular meeting. We won't have a regular meeting of council.
Understood. And as I understand, there were two proposed adult use medical marijuana, adult use dispensary pieces of legislation proposed. One is in effect right now. That's the more time-sensitive one, which had to do with permitting. And that is zoning, rather, because the state permits. So that's in effect, correct? Law Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's already been passed, yes.
Right. And so we have in place, what I'm driving at is I'm getting at the timeliness of this legislation. So we have in place the more time-sensitive one of the pair. What's before us here has to do with a potential community impact fee in our local ordinances. So maybe just to shortcut this, because we've been at it for a while, I support the language in the draft before us, which says if the state sales tax proceeds pledged to local governments by the state-initiated statute approved by the voters in November 2023, which says 3.6% of, essentially 3.6% sales tax, of the state tax will be paid to host committees. If there's a lowering of that amount, the local ordinance would take effect and make up the difference. Okay, we hope and don't expect necessarily that would happen, but that said, the state legislature is actively discussing all of these matters. And we do know that we expect significant traffic locally given our business profile. So that's in here now. I support that. I know there's been some discussion about that. The other issue I can identify is whether or not we strike, as the current draft would do, all of the existing medical marijuana regulatory rules and definitions. I personally think we should retain that because I'd rather not make a wholesale change unless there's a good reason to. And if we strike it now, we're probably never going to get these back. I think in other words, it's a detailed ordinance. Typically, we don't pass a detailed ordinance of this nature frequently. So if we take it out of the code today, it seems unlikely that it's going to go back into the code. The counter view would be if it's ineffective or if it's not functional or we don't expect it to be functional, why have it? Update your code. I think this is in the middle because technically it's still possible to apply for a medical marijuana license, although as we hear from the business leaders, the business practice is more likely that you would only get an adult use or adult use combined with medical marijuana, as opposed to medical marijuana only. But what I'm essentially arguing for is a bias in favor of local control. So I'd rather not negotiate against ourselves by repealing a bunch of code unless we have a specific reason to. And so that's my stated position. I just cut to the chase because maybe we can conclude in about 20 minutes here. If that view were to be carried by the committee tonight, we'd need some changes, which we probably can't do on the fly in committee tonight, and that's why I asked the timing questions. Councilman Baker?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would say that I think I think the decision before us is whether we want, so I think legislative history is important here. Initially, what Councilman Schachner proposed was basically taking away the medical part and just having any dispensary. So I think the question is not whether we have a licensing regime for just medical. The question is whether we have a licensing regime at all for adult use, for any marijuana sales, right? So I think that's a slight caveat what you said. I think it would be.
Is your mic on, by the way?
I believe it is. Okay. It was. So I think that the question would be not whether we require licensure for medical facilities and not adult use, but whether we require licenses, local licenses for any marijuana sales. And so.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I know that was his initial proposal, but I'm making my views known here.
Yeah, I would not support simply requiring licensure for medical and not adult use. I think if we were to have a licensure requirement, it would be for both. That would be my 2 cents. And I think to your point, the question becomes, if we do away with this licensure, I think the benefits of having local licensure is that if right now the state has a very robust regulatory regime for any sale of marijuana, whether that's adult use or medical. If what happens sometimes in state government, which is lobbying interest groups to have lots of money, push on the regulations, push on the licensure, then you've lost that ability as a local community to kind of come back and recreate it. But at the same time, we're council people, the administration has said that they don't, I think what they've said, and they can say it again or qualify my statement, that they think that the state is doing a good job and that we don't need a local licensure regime.
Yeah, they've also said that about other portions of the policy, and we're taking a different view. So, but I don't need to belabor the point. I think Councilman Schachner you want to weigh in?
I mean, we would have to look back towards the original, which I believe I put placeholders in there referring to any regulations created by the Division of Cannabis Control pertaining to adult use dispensary. I think there was also language that referred back or created definition or changed definition of what from medical marijuana dispensary to the meaning of marijuana dispensary, which would include medical and or adult. I have no problem with the view of going back and reinstituting that licensing regime. I agree with Councilman Baker that if we're going to do licensing, it should be for both or all, not just one or the other.
And I'll agree with that too. So let's agree with that as established. There's an argument to be made if don't go through this extensive code and procedures unless you're going to use it, right? If in practice, part of what I was arguing was that we'd hold and reserve some local control on the code, even if it is if we expect it to be dormant, because we expect for the moment the medical dispensary business practice to be dormant, but it could come back. Okay, but so I'm really arguing from a local government or local control principle point of view. I can see myself supporting a licensure requirement for both, or for the adult use, medical, and the combined license categories. correct me if I'm wrong, is the state eliminating the medical only?
No.
So the medical only exists, it's just that we don't expect, as a practical matter, many business entities to pursue it, right?
It's really that the licensing requirements for both really do overlap, and any concerns that we, as a city, would have in terms of marijuana dispensary, whether medical or adult use, I think adult use is going to be slightly more restrictive, or in the light of the states. So I think if you take the licensure requirements that adult use, or that they easily apply to medical. And I would also say, did have a point, if about burdensome on actually administering it, we could include language that is that the building department or designee or whoever can rely on the state's approval or the state sign off of the license as prima facie evidence that they meet our licensing requirements, something like that.
So your concept, Councilman Schachner, would be, it would read medical and/or adult use? It would cover...
It would cover both.
It would cover all circumstances. There was 3 categories. There's medical only, adult only, and combined, right?
Yes, and I believe that the original legislation did include that some requirements you looked at one section of the revised code, and for other requirements you look to the regulations promulgated by the Division of Cannabis Control, which is a different set of regulations.
Yeah, I think holistically, the city still has local control in the sense that zoning, right? So our code requires certain things of these businesses to operate, hours of operation, clearance for parking, ingress, egress. So we still have some local control. And the licensure does give you another tool to get more compliance, if you'd like, and understand the business more. But if it's a tool that the administration isn't going to use and doesn't think they need to use, then I would support just making sure we have the community impact fee. To me, and I spoke a lot about it at the last meeting we had, right, our residents overwhelmingly voted in favor of adult use cannabis, and so did I. But the difference is, you know, they also thought that their community was going to get 36% of the 10%, you know, to make sure that, and that may have motivated some people beyond just cannabis use, but also, you know, local government funding. So from my perspective, I'm comfortable passing or recommending this current substituted ordinance as amended to full council for approval.
Okay, I hear that. Any other comments from other council members? Councilman Striebeck, Marks, Councilwoman Keppel? Okay. I think, Councilman Schachner, you want to put down your marker? We don't have to debate this endlessly. So I prefer slightly the framework I'm proposing, but I'm mindful of the you know, the extensive nature of that, although Councilman Schachner, I think, proposed a version that could be licensure light, which would essentially say that the city has a licensure regime that's keyed off of the state. So that could, you know, now what would the significance of that be? I trust the city of Lakewood because that's us. I have less confidence in other branches of the government. That's really all I'm coming from. So rather than, I get the sense that the committee is not, you know, as enthusiastic as I am about that concept. You know, if circumstances arise that we think in a practical sense, or even in a legal principle sense, that this licensure, hypothetical licensure set of rules and regulations would be of use to the community, does the mayor and or the law department envision a, you know, not envision, could you potentially support adding a new licensure requirement if circumstances called for that? Although now, once you've got things rolling, can you add does legal precedent allow you to do it in the future?
Mr. Chairman, the precedent would allow us, but I want to make sure that you are comforted by what is already in place. Our conditional use permit structure, as Councilman Baker indicated, provides restrictions on the cannabis dispensaries in terms of where they can be located, distance among them, the design of them, the parking structure, the lights, the fencing around them, off-street parking, detailed security plan, signage regulation, windows regulation, and most importantly, and I think this is to your concern, it's a valid concern, Mr. Chairman, but the conditional use permit says that the permit issued by the city can be pulled, can be repealed, revoked, if the holder of the permit, adult use or medical use or dual use, violates any city regulation or state regulation. The state regulation implemented by the Division of Cannabis is extremely extensive, far more so than the regulations that the state put out for medical only. I can give you examples of what it is. It is so extensive that our regulation would just be a fraction. Our current medical regulation was just a fraction of what the Division of Cannabis is now doing, with good reason, because adult use brings different considerations than medical only use. By passing the Chapter 1165, which you did, and you did it with speed to be respectful of the industry that wanted to be up and running, it allows the city, it allows the director of planning not to renew a permit, and it allows the planning commission to revoke a permit of any of our dispensaries if it is determined by the city that the dispensary is not following or is in violation of the state, exhaustive state regulation. So your concern, in actuality, is addressed by the prior legislation.
Okay, that's helpful. I think I follow. What we're arguing is that the state statutes have evolved and grown, and that the licensure under the current state code has that portion covered, and the authority for our local control currently now for the adult and/or adult and medical permits arise from the factors you just listed, and many of those are longstanding traditional powers of a municipal government. And so even if the state were to change its mind on some of the rigor of its regulations, we still would have, well, let me phrase this as a question. Is everyone in agreement? If the state backpedals on the quality and rigor of its operational requirements, does the city still have a basis for saying your parking plan, your noise, your traffic management, your light pollution, et cetera, those all need to improve if we're going to renew your permit, even if the state statute changes?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. The city does have that authority, in my opinion. The State Division of Cannabis Regulation and the statutes themselves require all dispensaries to meet the zoning ordinances of the locality. Okay. We always have that authority to issue zoning regulation, number one. Number two, and as you recall, we had the authority to place considerable restrictions on the operations, the number of them, to allow them at all, et cetera. And we will maintain some authority. Once they're in, we do have issues once they're in. But given that we had that control to start with, I think we would have flexibility. Certainly have absolute flexibility on the zoning. Okay. Then finally, number three, our regulatory framework was married to the fee, the license fee on medical, as you recall.
Which we are now switching course to reflect the new state statutes.
That is correct.
Okay,
That
I
is
follow.
correct.
So thank you for that. It sounds like we may be ready for a motion.
Yeah, the slight distinction, and I don't want to belabor the point, but that, you know, zoning, planning, that's all outside of building. Licensure gets you in the building, right? And there is a benefit, I think, to that with the city government, but if it's not providing the benefit we want, right? I guess that's the distinction, right? So you hear the housing and building department say, well, we can look outside, we can't go inside, you know, unless there's some health safety issue. That's what licensure gets you as a city. But if we don't want it, then that's fine. But I think we should at least acknowledge that.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So, Councilman Shackner, would you like to revert to your original language, or would you like to propose or second a motion right now with the current draft? Because you could make a motion, but
Yeah, I'll make a motion to recommend the amended substituted, or the substituted amended ordinance for full council approval.
Second.
motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, back to your comment now.
Well, I just said.
Okay, I know you did, but the context of, can you speak to Councilman Baker's point about licensure?
I think the greater concern for the community at large is certainly stuff that happens on the outside of the building, not necessarily what happens on the inside.
Okay, and we're satisfied that the state has done a good job of the licensure for now.
We'll see.
Not very comforting, actually, Councilman.
We don't know.
But I mean, the whole logic of the pro-local control argument is that you'd rather not have to wait and see how good a job the state does. Okay, so I think we've talked about it enough, though. We've got I think a good deliberation, an agreement in principle, perhaps, that if circumstances suggest that we need to revisit a local licensure set of rules, that we would do so in the future, and that door remains open to us if needed. So any other discussion? I'm happy to support the motion myself. Any other discussion, council members? Councilwoman Striebig is marveling at the rigor with which we belabor the point. Huh?
The only thing that I would add is that I think Director Vargo's point is taken, that the state has done its job and really put in a lot of guidelines for us. Thank you.
Okay. Any other discussion? Hearing none. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Concludes our business for the committee. Without objection, we're adjourned. Gotcha.